Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The world is a little more uncertain than it used to be. Trade policy out of the U.S. has, on occasion, changed daily. And frankly, sometimes it's hard to keep up. The bottom line seems to be tariffs will bring higher prices, and that includes our food. Now, this was evident in the latest Canadian inflation reading for March when you look under the hood. The headline reading was actually down to 2.3% year over year from 2.6% in February. But grocery inflation was up 3.2% year over year in March from 2.8%. So moving higher and outpacing headline inflation. But trade issues, it turns out, are only part of the story. And that means the picture is not crystal clear going forward. I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of The Big Story, we look at food inflation, what happens next, and what can the new Liberal minority government do about it. Stuart Smyth is professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Saskatchewan. So let's start at the beginning. This food inflation in March, can you tell us what happened?
I think there's a couple of key reasons for that, Kris. One of them being that for virtually all of March, the Canadian dollar was valued at less than 70 cents US. So because, in wintertime, we import so much of our fruit and fresh produce from the southern US, and even those imports that come from other parts of the world, Latin America, as an example, all of those contracts are priced in American dollars. So when the Canadian dollar is worth less than 70 cents US, it has a very noticeable and immediate impact on food prices of things that we import. So I think that had an impact through March because the value of the Canadian dollar was low. And the other one was just simply the uncertainty due to the on-again, off-again tariff perspectives out of the White House, and that created a significant amount of uncertainty in trade markets, and so that uncertainty was then factored into these contracts. So if an importer wanted to import so many kilograms or tons of product X, that uncertainty as to whether or not tariffs may or may not be applied were factored in just in case they ended up being a reality at the point that the contract was executed. So no exporter wanted to be in a situation where they would end up having to pay a future tariff at the point a transaction occurred. So they factored the cost of that potential tariff in to the pricing of those contracts.
Was there also a seasonality about it all in that, in March, there are things that we can't grow in Canada? We have to get some of those products elsewhere?
I don't know that had a significant impact because so much of our production would have tailed off in October. So we had a number of months already. I think the one final factor that may have had an impact is that typically all of the retailers do that 90-day price freeze, what they call sort of the Christmas freeze. And that typically runs from some point in November through December and January, and either comes off at the end of January or at some point in early to mid-February. So there may be spillovers, through March then, that as contracts and were for products were brought in at those higher prices, that again, that sort of freezing of food prices through that holiday period were simply being reflected in the March food inflation numbers.
So it sounds like what you're saying, it had more to do with the value of our dollar than it did the trade whiplash that we're seeing out of the U.S., although that was part of the story.
Yeah, the trade was part of it, but the one that we can certainly quantify was the fact that the Canadian dollar was below 70 cents for virtually the entire month.
So having said that is sort of the backdrop, and I know the inflation data is a look back. So we have kind of an idea of where we go from here. The dollar's come up a little bit. Um, there's still a tariff situation in play. So, do you foresee higher prices for food in Canada, at least in the short term? Or has that peaked for the moment?
I think we could expect a bit of a plateauing of prices. So yes, the 90-day reprieve in terms of tariffs, as long as they're CUSMA compliant, will carry us into July. The fact that the carbon tax, at least temporarily, has been taken off the transportation of food items, and as you say, that the Canadian dollar has rallied a bit through the latter half of April, picking up a couple of cents. So I think those factors will contribute. So if there are tariffs being applied to products that are non-CUSMA compliant, then there would be an increase there. But I think these other factors, the higher dollar, the removal of the carbon tax, I expect it will come back with the new administration in one form or another, but that's likely to be several months down the road. So I think we could expect a plateauing possibly till this 90-day extension expires, which would be sort of about the first week of July. So maybe we get some stagnant, prices remaining relatively constant through May and June.
Interesting. Um, is there anything at this point that is a little more sensitive, maybe to upward pressures on the prices right now as you see it?
I'm not seeing anything that that's sort of waving a massive red flag. So 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 that's promising. I think by June, certainly some of the early Canadian produce will be available to start coming into markets. So I think again that's a bit of a positive sign that by maybe not late May, but certainly by mid June, some of the you know the more of the berry type fruits, right, the strawberries and
Mm.
stuff like that, and some of the early vegetables that are very readily produced in southern BC, southern Ontario, the Maritimes, may start showing up in grocery stores and helping to alleviate some of the price inflation that we've seen in the last month or so.
I also wonder about avian flu that's been a problem in the US, and that has led to, record prices for eggs, but it's not been an issue in Canada
Not to the
completely.
same extent.
Right. We're very separate from the US when it comes to eggs, correct?
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so we have supply management, and we have there's significant tariffs on the importing of eggs and other poultry products from the U.S. And so we have had some outbreaks of avian flu, but so they've been very well managed by the poultry sector. So other than maybe a little bit of an impact on turkey products. Um, Towards the latter part of last year, we're not seeing sort of significant challenges to the sector at this moment.
So we get the next reading on inflation in Canada on May the 20th, so about 3 weeks from now. Are you expecting the food inflation number to move lower again for April?
I think it could, with the removal of a portion of the carbon tax that may contribute to a little bit to some downward movements. And again, it's possible that the 90-day tariff reprieve may also reduce a bit of that uncertainty, but I don't think it entirely removes it. I think a portion of that uncertainty is simply going to remain in trade and food products, which could may not reduce inflation as much as people are hoping could be the case.
I feel like you're hedging a little bit throughout this conversation. And I mean, I'm not going to hold you to anything because, like, the reality is that There is a great deal of uncertainty in general, and things are very fluid, open to change at any given moment, in part because trade policy out of the US is really very volatile.
And that's part of the challenge, Chris, is even though they've said there was a 90-day reprieve, which has been in effect for 4 weeks, I'm not even confident that they'll make the 90 days. Something could happen within the White House, and suddenly they're back on next Tuesday. So we've set, and I think a lot of the trade sector feels the same way, is that even though they have said there's still another 2 months, they do not have the confidence to trust anything out of the White House about trade related aspects. So they may still be functioning as though if those tariffs are expected to come in next week.
Well,
If I was in that situation, I would. I would not trust the White House and would simply be trying to function with the potential of them looming over our head.
well, and that's sort of the message to Canadians as well. I mean, you're doing the best you can to sort of prognosticate where food prices will go, but you're dealing with the way the situation is in this moment in time, and it's a little more subject to change now than maybe it would have been 2 years ago.
Yeah, I would sort of compare it to spinning the wheel on Twister, right? Where you had 4 options, to spinning the wheel on The Price is Right, where you've got, considerably more options.
Well, and it certainly makes things difficult, and it's harder to sort of plan when there's a little more volatility involved.
Mhm. Mhm.
You mentioned the federal government and whether or not the carbon tax may or may not come back. We've just had a new government elected. It's a liberal minority government, so it's going to be sort of kept in check by the opposition parties. But it begs the question to me, even if the government wanted to do anything to help with food prices, is there anything it can do?
They've been pressured by some of the provincial governments. So in February, it was really the Nova Scotia government that kicked this off, and they said they were going to start to remove some of the interprovincial trade barriers that do have an impact on food prices. And so then a number of other provinces stepped in, and we started to see interprovincial trade barriers being removed. And then that forced the federal government into action, and they then met and removed about 50% of the existing interprovincial trade barriers. So there's still, I believe, somewhere between 17 and 21 or 22 interprovincial trade barriers in existence that the federal government could and certainly has the power and the mandate to say, we're going to get rid of all of these other interprovincial trade barriers to make a positive contribution towards reducing food price inflation. So we'll wait and see. There'll be a new cabinet sworn in here within the next sometime this month, likely, and see what direction and whether that turns out to be a priority for the new government and new agriculture minister.
Why were those interprovincial trade barriers put in place to begin with? Like, I assume that's going back quite a few years.
Yeah, protectionism, right? Quebec wanted to protect its brewing industry from, that was one of the examples, right? There was a court case a number of years ago dating back to a guy from New Brunswick who was bringing alcohol across the border from Quebec to New Brunswick and was fined because it violated the interprovincial trade barrier between Quebec and New Brunswick. So there's all kinds of these things to protect producers or industries in one province versus the neighboring province. Yes, they're outdated. They've been in place for, in many cases, for decades, and they were set up when the agriculture industry was maybe a little bit more subject to volatility that really those conditions don't exist anymore. Very similar to the reasons why supply management was set up over 50 years ago. We're still paying higher prices for all of the dairy and poultry products due to situations from 50 years ago that haven't existed for the past 30 years.
But it is interesting to a degree, is it not, that, sort of this upheaval coming out of the US is prompting Canada to sort of re-examine the way things operate within our own country now. Like maybe this wouldn't have been looked at otherwise.
Yeah, I certainly encourage the federal government to seriously consider whether or not supply management serves Canadians in 2025, because there's been a number of studies that suggest in the past few years that Canadians are not well served. We're paying considerably higher prices for dairy and poultry products compared to counterparts in the U.S. and China has already, and the United States and Europe have all said they have significant problems with Canadian supply management, and it reduces our ability to negotiate trade agreements that then allow us to get access to lower priced products. So, it's going to have to be a deliberate decision by the federal government to keep supply management in place and force higher food prices on all Canadians.
So very interesting. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your insight and your expertise on all of it.
Oh, my pleasure, Kris.
Stuart Smyth is professor in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of Saskatchewan. That wraps up another episode of The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other by emailing at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.